We are on. I'd like to welcome all the participants to this session on Give Back Yoga University. It's an online education platform for those who are interested in this intersection between yoga, science, and nonprofit work. And my name is Rob Schware. I'm the executive director of the Give Back Yoga Foundation. I'm delighted today to be hosting and speaking with Rajni Tripathi. Rajni is the new executive director of the Yoga Service Council, and she's got a 10-year. She's perfect for this position, in my opinion. She's combining this sort of 10 years already of working in the corporate and mindfulness world. She's the founder of Thought Transformation Institute, a mindset and meditation education company. And she's a board member of the American Women's Medical Association in Chicago. So welcome, Rajni.
Thank you, Rob. I'm excited to be here and chat. This is my first official interview for YSC. So I'm obviously nervous, as you know, because I'm very transparent about that. But I'm just looking forward to having the conversation and learning with you as well. I know it's an interview, but I know there's a lot I'm going to learn from you too.
So I'll share a personal story just to ease your nervousness as well. A long time ago, I was working in Calcutta and I befriended one of the leading economists in the country, Dr. Bodhan Chattopadhyay at the University of Calcutta. I think he was almost being awarded big prizes in the Indian government for his research. And he once told me, you know, Rob, before every one of my classes or presentations, which would be before hundreds of people, he had to go to the washroom 3 times. So that said,
fingers crossed, I don't have to deal with that.
You know, I like starting these interviews, Rajni, asking people, how'd you find yoga? I mean, what was your first class? What's just to sort of start going back to your original journey and the arc from a first class to being the executive director of the Yoga Service Council.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's I'm going to try to keep it short and concise. It's interesting. The introduction to yoga as we know it now, it actually for me came through the family philosophies. So the first 2 pillars that we usually in the yams and the niyams and, you know, santosh and satya, trust and contentment, all these things in practice and education, that's kind of where it began for me. And my maternal grandfather was a big proponent of education and really understanding how to keep a calm mind. So for me, the practice didn't begin on the mat. It began with a philosophy in the house. And I think I was lucky, to be quite honest, to be having and not even knowing, because I was a little girl, I had no idea what the hell was going on. People were talking to me about these principles and living them, embodying them. To me, this was just how life always was. And when I lived in India for several years, it was really, you know, getting so deeply immersed in the philosophy of this practice that it's just a lifestyle at that point. There's no distinction between how you're operating inside the house with this philosophy or outside of the house with this philosophy, no matter what the outside world is. And then when I came back to the States, my official first asana class was actually with Daniel Hickman, who's actually one of our board members at YSC. And it was a lot of fun. And he's like this smooth, calm presence when he teaches yoga. And he has this feeling of like, you do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So that was and again, I think I got lucky because I don't think everybody has that experience in their first yoga class. So that's how that happened. And, you know, so that was me coming into, now Daniel is not pop culture yoga. Daniel's very much in that service. He's a karma yogi. But for me, that whole introduction to that environment was the pop culture yoga. You know, it was really about the asana movement. It was about some breath come in. Back in those days, like 15 years ago or something, there was no meditation, you know, in the pop culture yoga scene. Now it's a different environment. But this concept of service in pop culture yoga is there. It's not as systematic. There's no real framework around it as much as there is in the actual yoga service field. So as I worked with this arena of service and pop culture, in that definition of a budding yoga community in the US, I eventually kind of found my own way of what service really meant for me, which was essentially about unconditional love for self and for others. And as that went on and time flashed forward, YSE drops into my lap somehow. I was originally going to be part of the Best Practices Project, which is, I think you know, it's our big guidebooks that we hold out for community members. My schedule didn't allow for it, but somehow YSE rolled back around, and next thing I know, I'm sitting on a Zoom call talking to some pretty fantastic people, and it was like completely, everything just came together. Like it was just beautiful.
So for those who aren't on this call, I think it's very important to note who Daniel Hickman is. Daniel's an amazing gifted yoga teacher who for probably 15 years now has been teaching a weekly class at the VA in Washington, DC. And he's someone who's extremely modest and gentle approached, as Rajni has characterized him, and now a board member of the Yoga Service Council. And to me, one of the most important qualities, which I think we'll come back to in this interview, Rajni, is Daniel shows up every week at the VA for 15 years. So showing up and yoga service with a connection between all of that. But let's step back for a second. So after that first class with Daniel, what happened? Did you want to become a yoga teacher? Did you want to go back to India and visit with your grandfather, or what?
After that yoga class, the first thing I did was cry because there was such an unraveling that occurred for me internally. And that was the beginning of my, I guess the best way to call it is this individual liberation almost of me internally. It was almost like, even though I had these yogic philosophies, through Daniel's class and his presence and everything, it's like someone had given me permission to be who I was, because my contending with who I was had a lot to do with the cultural norms that I was brought up in which yoga philosophy wasn't really part of that, but it's subtle, those things are subtle. So after that class, I cried a lot, just feeling very free. And I did not talk to my grandfather immediately about it, but I just started talking to my best friend, who's in DC, and started talking to her about it. My husband at the time, his family comes from a lineage of yogis as well. His grandfather was a very big yogi. And we started talking about like, well, now what do we do now with this? I've had this profound experience. He also did a few yoga classes and was part, what do we do now? And luckily, Daniel was teaching a yoga teacher training. And it just turned out where, okay, this feels intuitively, not cognitively, not from a processing perspective, but from a heart perspective. It's like, this is the next step. And my ex-husband and I took his yoga teacher training together, which was a beautiful experience.
So you say in the interview, which is posted now on Give Back Yoga Foundation's website, Rajni, under stories of impact, that when you were asked about what originally motivated you to get into service work, you said, I was originally motivated by a false narrative. I found that very interesting. Can you explain what that false narrative was?
Yeah. The false narrative for me at that time was more of a cultural mindset that was instilled in me. Not all Indian families have this. I mean, India itself is so diverse and there's multiple cultures within the country, as you know. But for where my family was at that point in time, it was really about, if you're not in service, you're not of value. If you're not in service, then you're not doing anything to better humanity. And while that's I understand that tying who my personhood was to a set of actions that were all external was difficult when I grew up, came back to the States, and started to think about who I was and who my identity is versus who I was told I'm supposed to be. And that was a very long process for me. It was a process of almost 10 years to unravel the storylines that were, I don't want to say fed to me, because that was just the culture at that point under my roof in the house. And that was the false narrative, where your value isn't until you do anything that is not in service. And that the box of how to be in service was very constrained. There was a set of actions, tied to it. And it went into this whole environment of almost like you don't have your own identity. You're supposed to do what you're told to do. And that was kind of the whole gamut of the false narrative. It took me a while, like I said, 10 years to really get comfortable with who I was versus who I was told I was supposed to be.
Well, I think 10 years is a short period of time to wake up, actually.
Not long.
And how did your yoga practice contribute to that process?
Huge. It was huge. It was like this somehow I finally got permission that on the mat, as I'm sweating and I'm practicing this, and I'm hearing the philosophical tenets come to me in a different language from a different teacher, it was almost like there was a release of all of this grief. And the grief came in a few different ways, a lot of anger as well. The grief came in a few different ways, but mostly it was about the anger and the grief combined of like, what the hell? Why was I taught this is my framework that I have to be in and there's no other option? So there's a lot of anger about that, anger towards myself. Well, why didn't you catch this sooner? And then eventually what yoga did, the pranayama practices, the breathing practices were such a critical component of this. Daniel's very big on that as well, and other teachers that I learned with. The pranayama practices, prana, everything's just like, it balances, it cleans out, it reduces, I don't even know, it's so freaking powerful. But that particular practice is what really allowed me to process the grief of letting go the attachment that I had of who I was supposed to be. Because even though I wanted to step into who I was, there's still an attachment there because it's safe. No matter how bad it is for you, no matter how uncomfortable for you, it's safe because you know it. I know that identity. I can continue to mold myself versus stepping into this new horizon, which I didn't know shit about. I had no idea what was going to happen on the other side. And it was the community, it was the family, it was the support of like I said, my ex-husband, who's now my best friend. It was all of these things that came to assist me in moving through those subtle attachments that show up. Just like the ego is overt and covert, attachments are also overt and covert in my belief system.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the importance of community, Rajni, and I want to go back maybe over 10 years to when the Yoga Service Council was established. And the first several years were the organic formation of a group of dedicated yogis and yoginis who came together every year at the behest of the Omega Institute for Holistic Studies from all over the country, and felt a kind of aloneness in the work that they were doing with the Art of Yoga Project or street yoga, whatever it was. And this was a way to start defining and reckoning with what is yoga service. And I've found over the years that to be a very continuous conversation as to what is yoga service, what is yoga therapy, how do those two differ, and what's the role of the helper or the fixer in all of this? Yeah, I mean, you said in your interview, it's not uncommon for the helper to turn out to be a manipulator or enabler. So can we sort of try to unpack what
Yeah.
yoga service is?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I just want to say you're a legacy team. Like you, Mark Lilly, Booker, Leslie Booker, Mary Lynn Clinton, like you all were the team that were ahead of your time, I feel. Because I think when you all came together and created that yoga service field, you had a sense of foresight that the rest of the yoga world didn't have. And you had your heart into something that the rest of the yoga world, what I deem as the pop culture world at that time too, just didn't have. So I want to make it really clear that where YSC is now and us stepping into the next decade had to do with all of you getting together and choosing to put community first and choosing to step away from the norms that you were already doing individually and create a bigger environment for those that want to align themselves or explore yoga service. And I think, just from that piece, yoga service is the practice of community. It is where we inclusively, bring together all these different perspectives and people and backgrounds to work towards something that is in service to a greater good. And that is, it goes into the field of social justice. It goes into the field of yoga in prisons. It goes into the field of criminal justice programs, systemic racism that exists in education. It goes into all of that. You all started that way before this shit got popular. So now that we're here and we're stepping into the next decade, we're doing everything that you all were doing. We haven't deviated from the original heart of what YSC was created for. Now, as we step into the next decade, we're just getting a little bit louder. We're just getting a lot more concise, about like specific projects and the bridging between education and advocacy, and we have that opportunity to do that because of social media. Like, we can be loud, absolutely. And the hope is that with YSC, with yoga service being the practice of community, and therefore the creation of collectives, that then more people in the pop culture world can get curious about like, oh, hey, I understood service to be this, but holy shit, there's a group of people and a group of organizations out there that are doing this in a framework. They're doing this in a systemic way. They're doing it in a systematic way. Had no idea. So to disrupt, I think, is also part of, at least how I see it and how we kind of envision at YSC now moving forward. It's a little bit of disruption. Like service is a lot of things, but ultimately it's about the inclusive community, and having something that you all really fostered was having the difficult, challenging conversations. And especially with YSC now, so for example, and then I'm going to go back to the helper and what you said earlier. This, our big annual conferences. One of the biggest reasons for these conferences that created its power was the fact that community got together, they gathered, and they had the most challenging conversations in a compassionate way. And that doesn't mean people didn't get angry. People did, but you worked through it. And this year, we have to do it a little differently, like the rest of the world. And so again, with Omega, who's such a huge supporter that you all, brought that relationship in 10 years ago, our focus on May 8th is cultivating radical belonging. And that radical belonging, we think is a very important conversation to have, because it's the opposite of this cancel culture that started to take weight last year. And for us, cancel culture doesn't really bring people together. There's no community aspect to it. There's a community aspect of shaming, of guilting, sure, but being able to have that compassion, accountability, which means communication, and how that builds community is kind of the bedrock of that. Does that answer half of your question, I think?
It does, half of it. So, but I'm a fresh 200-hour yoga teacher, and I want to help. I'm given to want to work in a shelter in my neighborhood. for abused women. I see the county jail close to me. These people need help from me, and now I'm a yoga teacher. What's, when you said it's not uncommon for that helper to turn out to be a manipulator or enabler, what did you mean by that? That's a very profound statement.
Thank you. This is where we go into the overt and the covert ways that the ego operates. It's going to be hard to say that teacher who's coming in, where is her relationship? Has she had personal experience with this population? There's so many variables at play, but something happens when someone becomes a yoga teacher. Something tends to happen, not all the time, not with everybody. And that is this sense of mind-blowing empowerment, this ability to tap into their own sovereignty as a human. And then the absolute, I have yet to see it go in another direction. The absolute next step is, how do I take this out to my community? People need to know how freaking powerful yoga as a whole is. And that desire is beautiful. We want to foster that. We want to cultivate that. But we have to dig deeper into that. And the depth of that goes into the covert way that ego operates, the covert way that someone's relationship to the victim-villain relationship is. So when you're going into this environment, a group of abused women in a shelter, your heart absolutely is there. Of course it is. But let's dive a little bit deeper, where it's like, do you feel you want to help them because you think that you are better than them? Do you want to help them because it makes you feel egotistically like bigger? You have to analyze those psychosocial elements. And I think I wouldn't want to put pressure on any new yoga teacher or any yoga teacher to be like, okay, before you go do this service, I need you to answer these questions for me. Like, I would never want to do that. Go have the experience, see what happens. Because yoga is such an experiential practice that go have the experience of teaching at the shelter, come back, have a self-reflection process. That's the other thing. Your practice, the first two in the 8-limb piece of yoga, the first 2 limbs, the yams and the niyams, the observances and the practices and all that, those are the 2 fundamental things that are inherently, in my opinion, missing from the pop culture world. Everyone wants to go straight to asana, straight to pranayama, straight to meditation. And it's really about the everyday nuanced practices, which is self-reflection, which is education, which is ritual. Ritual from a cognitive perspective grounds the body, grounds the mind, so that you're able to be more open. So what are those tenets in your everyday living? It's fine if it's just the asana practice. Great. How about in 2 weeks, that person incorporates a little bit of meditation? Maybe they sit and they read a passage and let that be the guidebook of how their body moves. There's so many different ways. It's all about that individual liberation that then goes out to the collective liberation.
That's a brilliant way of putting it, Rajni. One of my first, if I may share, one of my first yoga teacher trainings was with a good friend and brother now, James Fox, who started the Prison Yoga Project. And the first thing we did, and I have this here on my desk because it's one of the only pieces of paper, except for a photograph of my beloved wife, that stays all the time here. It's a page by In the Service of Life by Dr. Rochelle Riemann, R-E-M-E-N. And any attendees listening today, please Google that. In the Service of Life, Rochelle Riemann. And one of the things she says is that I think I would go so far as to say that fixing and helping may often be the work of the ego. That's what you were saying.
Yeah.
And that service work is the work of the soul. Service is an experience of mystery, surrender, and awe to something greater. And what you were talking about, Rajni, is, in how we're doing this because it's something bigger than us. And that which is bigger than us is a whole lot of social justice issues and self-reflection issues, consciousness raising, and being in a conscious community.
Yeah. I will say, you know, I am not of the belief that yoga equals social justice. I am of the belief that it's yoga and social justice. The practice is so powerful that throughout, it's one of the reasons why these practices have lasted for really long, because they work and they're integrated into society. So I always feel it's yoga and this, yoga and that as part of the process. And when we look at that service component of it, I think if I take a step back and go back to that whole individual liberation, how it goes down to the collective, one of the most profound experiences I have had at YSC, I've been here about a year now, is how all of this is practiced, the awe that you're talking about, the perspective that service is bigger than anything else. It's a soul work. I've never seen it so embodied as I have with my team at YSC. I mean, the board, the staff, we are here because we believe in all of those things. Because we've been able to move past the pop culture-ness of it. We've been able to move past the overt and covert ego elements of it. We're human, sometimes the shit still comes up, but still. Overall, we have this team that so fully embodies everything that this author just said, this person just said, that you told us. I've never had an experience like that, to be so cohesive with the team. Because internally, if we can represent those values of developing community, being inclusive, culturally sensitive, community-oriented, all those kinds of things, that makes our job that much easier when we go out and produce our resources, when we create our content, when we create gathering opportunities for those that need support, whether they're BIPOC, LGBTQ communities, or for those that are living in a white dominant community and just don't know where to go, or made a mistake and they're like, oh shit, now what do I do? Who do I turn to? You know, and from a person perspective, yes, literature, yes, content, of course, but from a person perspective, who do I turn to? And the thing with YSC as we step into this next decade, starting in March, you're going to see a shit ton of things come out from us and a lot of different things come out from us. Courses and revamping a lot of the internal stuff that we collectively have decided. And that's a pretty big deal because it's not just one person doing it, two people doing it. There's a shit ton of people involved in this. So to get consensus, and sometimes voting, I'm more like, let's push for voting rather than consensus for some items when it's business related. But for all of us to kind of come together and recognize that if we don't do this situation on the inside, we're not going to be able to do this on the outside. I've never had that experience in any organization, in any yoga studio.
So in 4 years, how will you know you've been successful?
Well, as you know, you run a business, right? Metrics. We're going to know. The basic element of that is going to be the metrics. It's going to be a lot of the response from the community. So if we're putting something out and the community is like, you know what, this isn't that beneficial, but this is, are we able to make that turn? And if we're able, the way we're going to be able to make that turn is if we internally are prepared and aligned to be able to be of true service to what the community needs. And you can't do that if you don't have authenticity, transparency, and a value system based on communication and collaboration. You just can't do that. So that's going to be a way, you know, information is going to come to us. My hope is, so my background, you know, for a very long time, I was in intelligence and counterterrorism. So my hope is that in these next 4 years, some of the other ways we're going to do it is you're going to see how much of our resources are going to go out into the different communities. And we're going to try and reach out on all the different regions of the US and continue to help those who want to develop their yoga service networks, especially in the world that we're living in right now, and eventually take that internationally. Because what's happening in the US, yes, it's within the US, but there are elements of that are happening in other countries. Like, you know, in India, the caste system. I think there's a shit ton that we can do with that when we are prepared and ready to be able to look at that from a yoga service perspective. And we have an advisor, Prashant, who is already boots on the ground doing that work there. So we have some arena there. So those are kind of be some of the ways that we'll see. My hope is that as our team gets bigger, we still stay, I don't know what the right word is, but we still stay so deeply devoted to each other. That's really where we're at internally, where we are at right now. We're just devoted to each other, and we're devoted to service as soul.
So you mentioned your particular leadership style, and this is a question I'm throwing out now because I think one of our attendees at this session is writing a dissertation on yoga and leadership. What is leadership in the yoga world mean to you, and how do you embrace it?
Yeah, great question. Leadership is nothing without your community, first off. I mean, and leadership is not a hierarchy. It's not a traditional corporate world. What do you have? You have presidents, vice presidents, and you kind of go down that hierarchy. So for us, when we live at YSC, we believe in a shared leadership framework and a shared leadership model. So my opinion is just as important as our board chairs, Lynn. There's no hierarchy there. If we have our executive assistant who's going to have an idea, who feels strongly about something, get her in the conversation and let's talk about this. So it's like yoga and leadership. It's yoga and shared leadership is really what our framework is. It's that development of conscious relationships, the development of the conscious communication skill sets. That doesn't mean that in this leadership style, we're not going to screw up. It doesn't mean that someone is not going to have a shitty day, and for whatever reason, they're triggered and they have to have a moment. What that really means when that happens is, are we prepared as a shared leadership team to be able to hold that space? And we have a lot of skills within our team members who have the background to be able to do that. We've got therapists and coaches, which is really important in the makeup of the shared leadership team. You need to have people who have some expertise in that as well. But essentially, when you're holding that space, and if there's two people that are triggered, where's the conflict resolution? Have you had that conversation as a team? Is there a document with signatures that talks about conflict resolution and expectations and responsibilities? What are Lynn, who is so huge on that, and she is like the heart and soul of our team, literally at YSC.
Lynn Boucher.
Lynn Boucher. Boucher. I always screw up her last name. I know she can't say anything right now, but I always screw it up. She's very big on this, on what are the community rules? And they're not rules so that we stay confined. They're rules so we have, again, a framework. So if you're choosing to lead anywhere, you've got to have that framework intact, and you've got to have your values in place. Otherwise, you can't lead anything.
There's a lot of material you just gave someone for a dissertation in those few minutes, Rajni. So it's messy, it sounds like to me. And if there's anything that I have experienced in past Yoga Service Council meetings, it's being able to host a container with maybe 100 or more people where things really do get messy, and having to consciously sort that through and stop everything else, which is incredibly uncomfortable. But I've seen that happen, and I guess that's what you're saying is an essential part of the board and the way in which you lead the organization.
Yeah, and I would say it's not even me leading. It's all of us leading. I just happen to be like the face. But I will say something, you brought up something very, very powerful, which is when you're with a group of, as you've experienced, hundreds of people, and you've got to stop everything and contend with and put yourself aside so that you can explore what's happening right now for one person or a group of people. The key thing for those that are, so quote unquote, running the ship, like YSC is running the organization, is to make sure, as part of that shared leadership, is to make sure it's not just you doing this. Having to step out of yourself, stop everything, and address what's going on. You've got to have your team on the ground to be able to help and have a game plan, have a contingency plan. That's part of this leadership environment, the framework. Because then what happens is that when you step out of yourself, which is service, to really have to put yourself aside in a way, but not in a way that harms you. You've got to have your team of like 5 or 6 people that are like, okay, now's the time. Everything off, we are all in it. So that the perspective and the conversation direction is not just coming from one person having to manage. That's too much for that person. But it's coming from a group of people that can provide. If there's 5 people, there are 5 different perspectives coming into play here. And those 5 different people could be helping like a group of 10 in this corner, another group of 10 in this corner. That's what we're talking about in terms of shared leadership. But most importantly, being able to hold that space when you have a lot of people in the room and to do it in a way that's effective. Because it's when someone's having, say, a meltdown, someone's angry, it's not personal. It's about that person's experience. You most likely, in this scenario, were not part of the experience that created that reaction, that trigger for them, necessarily the bedrock of it, but you're there now. So remembering that it's not personal is a really key part of shared leadership, but also a really key part of how you can show up in your community in one of the best ways possible. Not everybody can do that. We're not talking about trauma here as well. There's a lot of that needs to happen, but just having that in consideration.
I want to open it up for any participants. If you have questions, please send them into the chat and I will refer them to Rajni. Rajni, tell us a little bit more about the next few steps informationally about the Yoga Service Council. And you mentioned a May 8th conference.
Yes.
On cultivating radical belonging. What is it? How do people get engaged? What does the next year look like?
Yes. So well, boy, so where do I begin? There's so much that is happening. We'll start with the conference. On our website, yogaservicecouncil.org, if you go to conferences, you'll see conference 2021. If you click on that, you can go ahead and provide your email so that you get our newsletter. So as we announce our panelists and key topics and stuff, people will know. And then through the newsletter, essentially, that's our biggest communication point. It's really our newsletter. So what we would love is those that feel slightly interested, go ahead and place your email in that, and the newsletter will provide more information about when registration opens and all sorts of different things. Now, in terms of what you said, what to expect from YSC from the next year, there is so much, Rob. We have shit ton of educational webinars coming on. Lynn, I always talk about Lynn. I talk about Lynn a lot. But she just recorded an educational webinar on the art of gathering that was inspired by Priya Parker's book. It's a beautiful, Steve Kane, one of our other members, did that. We've got other folks doing that will be doing it as well. Educational webinars are coming out. We have I'm really excited for this, an intro to yoga service program coming out. So if people want to understand what the hell is this, they have a place to go. And it's about 6 experts and thought leadership folks who are creating these educational webinars, and we'll have value-add documents and content for folks to take it to the next step if they want to. But that's like a big one I'm super excited about. We have another course coming out about the niyams and the yums, so the first 2 pillars in that 8th step of yoga, as it relates to service. Because I don't think that bridge is necessarily talked about too much. So we have that coming out later this year. Oh my God, so many things. I can't even think about it. Our website's getting rebranded. So we're having a slight little name shift that's happening. There's a lot of community development, the development of regional yoga service networks. So if you're an individual or if you're a studio and you're like, I'm really interested about this, I don't know what the hell to do, I don't even know what the first step is, get a hold of me, get a hold of somebody, and we will help you develop that regional. That's a big thing we're focused on. The other few things we'll say is for our members and peoples in the community, because of this online virtual platform, we're going to start creating these routine online gatherings for people in the BIPOC and the LGBTQ communities. So not only hold the space, but to have really in-depth conversations that have like an action plan attached to it, steps attached to it. And then another online gathering to support those that, you know, if they're in a white dominant community or they're white and they're kind of having a difficult time with some of this stuff happening in the world out today, a supportive gathering where then they can talk about their mistakes, continue to make mistakes. And again, what YSC has always done so best, which you all fostered when you started YSC back in the day, was being able to have this compassionate conversation and a place to hold that person like tenderly, but with accountability as well.
So the first step is signing up for this conference on May 8th, right? And it's a conference. What's it look like exactly?
Great question. So it's on May 8th, which is Saturday. It's going to run morning to early evening. And actually, one of the key things of us talking about cultivating radical belonging is what I talked about earlier: compassionate accountability and transformational action, the building of community. Those are the key tenets that we're really going to talk about, because compassion accountability is the opposite of cancel culture. And so we're going to talk a lot about that. We're going to have practices. We're going to have some fun sessions. We're going to have some music, mocktails, you know, while people are eating and just having a good time. We're going to have home rooms, or a room where people can just kind of come in during the duration of the day, just to kind of be with their communities and their people. And we'll have like identity specific rooms as well, movement, meditation. I mean, we're going all out, especially because we cannot physically be with the community and just like hug them. So it's like, how the hell do we make this in a way that feels like we're hugging everybody virtually? Like, that's the objective.
Well, I'm gonna look forward to joining, and as you said, I will greatly miss Lynn Boucher twirling me in her aerial yoga.
We should do a newsletter about that. Like, hey, do you know these two?
Rajni, I want to thank you for investing time with Give Back Yoga University and for your work with the Yoga Service Council. I want to close with a quote from you, which is on the Give Back Yoga Foundation's website, Stories of Practice, Impact Stories, where you say, yoga is the practice of self-liberation that translates out to the collective's liberation. It is something that can be applied throughout time to assist and serve in a way that levels up the world. I really appreciate that phrase. Let's all keep leveling up our worlds. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Rob.